Thank you, John. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon to tell you a little bit about what I did last year, what I learned while participating in the Teaching Scholars Program. These numbers are going to be up once again later on, so if you haven't done this already, we will come back to it, not to worry. Okay, so before I started the Teaching Scholars Program, I didn't really know too much about what it was about, and so I'd like to start by telling you guys a little bit about what the Teaching Scholars Program is about, where it got started, and what its intent is. The Teaching Scholars Program began in the Department of Medical Education and Biomedical Informatics in 1995, and it has the two primary goals in mind of preparing faculty for local and national leadership roles, and as well of promoting academic excellence by fostering a community of educational leaders to innovate, enliven, and enrich the environment for teaching and learning at the University of Washington. Since the program was started back in 1995, there have been 258 teaching scholars, and that's including the group that started just this past September. Most of the clinical departments here at the University of Washington have sent people to the program, and as well there have been teaching scholars coming from the schools of nursing, the physician assistant school, the School of Psychology, Pharmacy, and the School of Law, as well as the School of Dentistry. So it's a relatively diverse group that you find. The enrollment in the Teaching Scholars Program has grown significantly since the inception of the program back in 1999. During the first 5 years or so of the program, there were on average between 5 and 8 participants per year, and that's essentially doubled or tripled depending on which set of numbers you're looking at, with now, in the past 5 years, there have been 15 to 16 teaching scholars per year. When it comes to lab medicine, we've had 3 people attend the program. The first was Nancy Goodyear from microbiology back in 2001. I, of course, did the Teaching Scholars Program this past year, and Lori Soma, who's in Hemapath, is doing the Teaching Scholars Program this year. So now I want to give you a little bit of an idea of the curriculum and also how the program itself is structured. The Teaching Scholars Program is a 10-month program where students meet for about a half day each week, usually on Tuesday mornings. And we discuss a variety of topics. They include core concepts that are set by the directors of the program. And as well, there's some participant-derived curriculum. So there's some similarities between the program from year to year, but as well, the topics change a bit based on the needs and interests of the participants. There's a focus on team teaching in the Teaching Scholars Program, with most of the sessions being taught by the participants themselves. And the program ends with a capstone Teaching Scholars project, which you work on throughout the course of the program and then present at the end in a poster presentation format. Many of the teaching scholars will then go on to present these posters or their projects in national meetings, or they'll go on to have publications resulting from these in the medical education literature. So the curriculum, as I mentioned, can vary a little bit from year to year. I'd like to now just give you a sense of the different types of topics that we covered during my year. And they fell under 3 broad topics, so I'm going to tell you about these next. So the first is learning about how people learn. So we started by getting a sense of a scholarly approach to the way that people learn. And to do this, we covered a variety of topics. The first thing that we did, which was relatively accessible, is to read the book Brain Rules. There's a copy of the cover here. It was written by John Medina, who's an educator out of Washington State University. It's a great read for those of you who are either educators or who communicate with anybody at any point in your lives. It's a very nice introduction to how to improve what you do as a teacher. We then went from the more accessible to the slightly less accessible by talking about a variety of different educational theories, which gave us a new vocabulary with which to think about the way that we teach. They include the bioscience theory of education, cognitive behavioral theories, and sociocultural theories. We learned about self-regulated learning, about self-determination theory, and learned to distinguish intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and how to navigate that in our students. So from the theoretical, we moved on to some practical tools to help us become better educators. Some of the tools that we talked about to improve our teaching skills included things like how to design better goals and objectives, curriculum design, how to go about engaging our learners, perhaps using things like technology in the classroom, how to write better test questions and better clinical cases to use for teaching. We also learned about some tools for publishing in the medical education literature. So one of our topics, for instance, was titled Qualitative Research. A lot of times here in laboratory medicine, we're thinking about numbers, but we don't think quite as much about qualitative assessments of our studies. Med-Ed Portal is something I'd like to let all of you know about if you don't know about it already, and especially if you're clinician educators. Med-Ed Portal is a forum by which you can publish things like educational tools or curriculums. It's a peer-reviewed format, and if you're a clinical educator, it's a great thing to note on your CV. So the third broad category that we covered was personal and professional development. And here we covered topics including reflection, feedback, how we're assessed as clinical educators, and ways to improve our CVs, in particular our teaching portfolios. And here we also learned about improving our leadership skills. So this is a broad overview of the topics that we discussed in the Teaching Scholars program and a broad overview of its structure. There are two big lessons that I really took away from the program and that I've incorporated into my practice and into my teaching, and that's the importance of engaging your learner and also the critical role of feedback. So for most of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about these two specific things. Now let me start with the importance of engaging your learner. So in medical education, in many forms of education for that matter, lectures are the predominant mode of instruction. And what we usually do when we're giving a lecture is sort of teach by telling. So you may recognize this unfortunate educator from the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Hopefully I'm not dating myself with this. Perhaps I am. I don't know. But this unfortunate educator lectures and then tries to engage his students by asking the question, anyone? So unfortunately, what that leads to is a room of students that look relatively unengaged. We have some students that are napping, a couple that are passing notes, no one who's really engaged in the process. And so this teaching by telling often leads to a relatively unengaged student body. By contrast, it might be nice to have a teaching environment more like the one created by Robin Williams' character in the Dead Poets Society. Here, all the students are very engaged in the learning process. They're actively interacting with each other and as well interacting with their instructor. Now, it's been shown that as compared to static lectures, providing an active learning environment or active learning experience improves many different aspects of learning. And that includes things like comprehension, retention, and performance on exams. Now, of course, in laboratory medicine, we faculty and staff are very interested in numbers and often want data. So let me provide you with some data. This is a quote from Freeman and colleagues who said, "Let's structure our teaching on evidence rather than tradition," and I would advocate for that. So let me tell you a little bit about what Freeman and his colleagues found. So this group, coming out of both the University of Washington and the University of Maine in Orono, performed a meta-analysis in which they included 225 studies that reported data on exam scores or failure rates of students that were performing in undergraduate STEM courses. And in case you don't know, STEM courses refer to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So in looking at these students and looking at these various meta-analyses, they found that 158 of the studies they looked at used an active learning setting. And so the definition of active learning here varied quite a bit. It included classes where there were occasional small group problem-solving sessions, where students worked in class on worksheets or tutorials, where students used audience response system or a personal response system, and where classes were designed as a workshop rather than a lecture. Now, when it came to formal lectures, they had 67 studies that were represented in this group. So in comparing test scores, pass rates, and failure rates of these two groups, they found a significant difference. So here in the blue area under the curve, you have active learning strategies, and in the orange, you have lecture-based strategies. What's represented by the two lines, the orange and the blue line, are the failure rates. And what they found is that there was a 12% change in the failure rate with only well, I shouldn't say only, but 21.8% of students failing in the more active learning setting, but an increased number, 33.8%, failing in a static learning session. So just to state this in a different way, students in classes with traditional lectures were 1.5 times more likely to fail than students in classes that had an active learning environment. And this is a pretty significant deal. In addition, they found that looking at students with an active learning environment, exam scores actually increased by about 6%. So taking the information from this, from my perspective, it's really important that we are engaging our students in the classroom, even in a lecture format. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about how I have tried to incorporate this. Now, one of the things that I do as a hematopathologist and someone who does a lot of flow cytometry is I participate in the activities of my professional society, and that's the International Clinical Cytometry Society. This society has an annual course, and I've been a lecturer in the course for several years. And for the past 2 years, I've been course director as well. Now, this is a course that takes place over 2.5 days. We have about 14 lecturers. It varies a little bit per year. And the student number is usually around 150. So this past year, it was held in Seattle. Just this past October, we had 180 students, and the year before, 142. So it's a pretty big group, and the courses are taught generally in a classroom setting. So I've been trying to find ways to increase the interaction between the students and the faculty, and as well to engage the students. So 2 innovations that we've tried that I have found to prove quite useful in this setting, in a lecture-based setting, a classroom setting, is audience response technology. And just this past year, I introduced an online question-answer forum. So I'd like to now tell you a little bit more about each of these. So the first intervention was the audience response system. Now, this is a very well-established tool for engaging learners. It's not something that's new. It's not even something that's new in the setting of the ICCS course. It's been used in the ICCS flow cytometry course for about the past 5 years or so with pretty good results. For the ICCS course, I use a different type of software, but I want to make sure that you know that you have access to audience response software here at the University of Washington. And that software is called Turning Point software. It's available to all faculty to use during your lectures, and I'd encourage you to try it. I've used it in the course, of course, but also I've used it in a few different teaching settings for medical students, for instance, and also for the medical technology students, and both of them have enjoyed using it. So let's try it out here. You can see just how easy it is to use, hopefully. Hope I didn't jinx myself by saying that. So what I'd like you to do if you brought your smartphone or a tablet is to go to the website RWPoll, so just rwpoll.com. You can do this opening any browser, and I have my smartphone that someone can borrow if you'd like. If you don't have one, you're welcome to use it if you'd like. So hopefully that'll just refresh. Okay, so one of the first screens that you see should be this one. Just nod your head for me if you're seeing this screen here. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now when they ask for a session ID is enter this number, 670299. Okay, so you will then click Join Session. And the next thing that you'll see will probably be a place where they'll ask you for your name. You don't have to enter your name or anything. Just click Join. Okay. And I see a couple of people still working with their phones. While you're doing that, I just want to let you know if you're watching this presentation from another site, I know it's broadcast to other places. You can still participate. If you're at the SECA or Harborview, you can participate. And so the message for you guys is if you're teaching a webinar or something like that, you can still use something like this to engage your audience at another site. Okay, so let's try a question. So the first question I have for you is, have you used audience response technology during your lectures? And I just opened polling. So just nod your heads for me so I can see if you have the question. Did it just pop up for you? Okay. So go ahead and answer. It's not displayed for you, but I can see how many responses I have to the question now. So I can see that 25 people have responded so far. Let's see, we're up to 26. That looks like about what we're going to get. So why don't we now see what answers people have given? Okay, so it looks like a fair number have actually used the audience response technology before, about 30%, and 70% haven't used it, at least haven't used it as of yet. So let's move on actually to the next question. I'm going to reset polling, and your question now is, would you like to use audience response technology during your lectures? And I can see that more people have been able to log on because now I have 33 responses. Okay, so let's see what we've got. Ah, fascinating. So some people would like, many people, most people, 76% would like to use audience response technology, but we do have a few holdouts. 24% are not interested. Well, this next slide is for you. I want you to know why you should, whether you want to or not, at least consider using audience response technology in your lectures. There's a benefit to using this technology both from the trainee perspective and from the faculty perspective. From the perspective of the trainees, people felt that they learned better from lectures that incorporated audience response systems. They had a greater comfort or reported a greater comfort in answering questions using the ARS systems. And they noted that they were more likely to actually attend lecture when the lecturer was using an audience response system. And if any of you have lectured for the medical school students, you know that that's a big drawing point. From the faculty perspective, faculty note that students appear to be more engaged when audience response systems are in play. And you're also better able to gauge the level of understanding of your students in real time. You'll know if they're answering the question you have asked correctly, or if you perhaps need to reinforce a topic. When it comes to retention of medical knowledge is really suboptimal in the passive learning setting, like a lecture. Retention, in fact, becomes even poorer when you increase the amount of information density that's presented and with the time after lecture delivery. But this can change if you use audience response systems, or at least can be improved. So what I'd like to do now is just give you a couple of examples of this. The first comes from the family practice setting. This is from a study by Shakow and colleagues that was conducted in a family practice residency program. They took their didactic lecture series and had people give a static lecture. After an interval, they'd give a lecture using the same lecture using an audience response system. And then they'd switch around. And they randomized the students to the group that would get the static and the audience response system lecture. Now, retention was significantly better during an immediately post-lecture quiz in the lectures that used audience response systems, with a comparative score of 96% versus 61%. So a pretty big difference there just at the post-lecture setting. Now, if we looked at a 1-month follow-up, those improvements were retained. So we still had improved scores using the audience response system at 1 month after the lecture is given. So you have both an improved retention right directly after the lecture, and those results are lasting. Now, just to prove that this is not the only study in which this has been demonstrated, this is another study by Rubio and colleagues this time, and this time in the radiology education setting. So this group looked at radiology residents at their didactic lectures. They'd pick just one lecture, gave it as a static lecture, and then had as well the alternative of an audience response system with the same content. And they found that students did better on a post-lecture quiz with the audience response system, and as well found that even at 3-month follow-up intervals, the students did better. They retained more material. So there is one caveat I want to mention here, perhaps for those of you that aren't excited about incorporating audience response systems into your lectures. And that's that what I didn't tell you about example 1, that family practice setting, is that there was a third group, and this third group was a group in which the faculty interacted verbally with the residents during the lecture, but didn't use the audience response system. So for instance, they would ask them questions, the students would answer during the lecture. And this group also did quite well on their post-lecture quiz and at 1-month follow-up. So it seems like interaction is really the key here in engaging the students. Okay, so let me tell you now about the second intervention, and this is something that I just tried this past year in the ICCS course, and that's an online question-answer forum. So given the size of the ICCS course, I wanted to increase the access students had to the faculty of the course. And to do this, I developed an online question-answer forum, along with the society management company SPL Track. So the perceived benefits, or what I thought would help the students using this system, was that everybody would have a chance to ask a question. They could do so anonymously, and they wouldn't have to be embarrassed to raise their hand. The moderator, myself in this case, I was also able to see if there were certain questions that were getting asked again and again and again. So I was alerted to problems perhaps in comprehension or confusion that was coming up during the lecture with regard to different topics. This system also allowed students to ask a question about a lecture that came into their mind maybe an hour or two after the lecture, later on during the course, but not during the lecture, and it gave the faculty a little time to think about their answer before answering the question. So this is what the attendee portal or the student portal looked like. They would have a chance to ask a question. They type in the text of their question and click the green button to ask the question. This is just, I know you can't read this, but I just want to show you this is how the different questions were displayed for the students. They could go to a website and see the various questions, and I, as the moderator or one of the faculty as well, could see the questions. During the course of this 2.5-day session, there were over 200 questions that were asked, so students were definitely very engaged in the process. In terms of answering the questions, I would answer some of them during the course of the lecture, especially if they seemed to point to a comprehension problem or something that perhaps I could just clear up quickly. If there were questions that were asked commonly, I would collect these, consolidate them into a single question, and then ask the lecturer this question during the live question-answer segment of the course. And then additional questions I'd pass on to the faculty to answer. And if students wanted to return to the question-answer forum, they could click on a question. For instance, if you clicked on this green question here, you would get the following response. This is just what the format looked like. So we just started this. This is the first year we've tried it, and it was just in October. I have course evaluations from a segment, but probably not all of the students as of yet. So far, I have 59 course evaluations that have been returned. And I asked some questions about this online QA system since it was new. Now, almost 70% of the respondents said they used the online QA system, which was gratifying. And when asked how useful they found the online QA system, the majority found it either very useful or at least somewhat useful. I asked for specific comments about the online QA system from the respondents, and these are the kind of things that people said. One person said, "I liked it. People seem more likely to ask questions." Someone noted that they liked the anonymous audience interaction part. It was noted that the QA forum allows for better interaction with the speakers for individual queries and saves time. And someone else noted that they liked the format very much and thought the QA forum was an excellent addition to the course, which they hope would be present in the future. So certainly this is something that we'll continue to do in the future and hopefully refine a bit as time goes on. Okay, so big classrooms. I don't know if anyone here was a student at the University of Washington and took Intro to Biology, but this is an image from the Intro to Biology class from 2010, led by Professor Toby Bradshaw. It was given in Kane Hall, and believe it or not, there are about 700 students in the room. So you can imagine this would be a challenging group to engage, but one of the ways that they engaged these students is using an audience response system. Here you can see a student holding their turning point clicker. Now, of course, we can do these with our smartphones, or students can do them with their computers as well. So I've been talking about this bigger classroom setting. Now I want to move to this individual student and talk about ways to engage that student further. And with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my Teaching Scholars project. My Teaching Scholars project was creating a bone marrow tutorial, and this was an interactive, or is an interactive tool for teaching bone marrow morphology to beginners. I have a couple of screenshots of the bone marrow tutorial. It's built into PowerPoint, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it in a moment in terms of the functionality, how it works. But first, let me give you some information about the rationale. Now, being in laboratory medicine, all of us are in fields that are somewhat specific. We have our own set of terminology. We have our own set of tools there are a lot of new things that any sort of trainee coming into our world has to pick up at once. So with these new skills, activities, equipment, and terminology, trainees can sometimes get a little overwhelmed at the beginning. So although their lectures in hematopathology might allow them to feel comfortable, insert a microscope, a lot of different types of cells, and then things can start to get a little bit confusing. So overcoming this initial period of confusion can take a pretty high activation energy in some cases. Learning the basics can be challenging not only for the trainee, but also for the faculty who is trying to introduce this new topic to a beginner. It takes a significant investment of faculty time, and that's faculty time that perhaps might be more productive if it's spent teaching things like decision making, or information processing, or other types of higher level diagnostic tasks. Also, our trainees start at staggered intervals, so sitting at the same microscope, you'll have someone who's just been on Hempath for a day, and someone who's been there for 2 months. So while one person is struggling to stay afloat, the other is bored. So to this end, or to address this problem, I created the bone marrow tutorial. And it's an electronic educational tool that I use to introduce bone marrow morphology to trainees starting in hematopathology. It presents an approach to morphologic review of bone marrows in a measured and accessible format with the goal of increasing trainee comfort and reducing their time to proficiency in evaluating bone marrow studies. The module that I've created at this point reviews normal bone marrow morphology at a beginner format in an interactive electronic format. And I'm going to show it to you in just a second, but before I do, I want to mention Panopto to you. Just by show of hands in this room, anyone tried out Panopto? Okay, one person, excellent. So let me just tell you a little bit about Panopto. It's a tool that you'll have available to you as a UW faculty also. I use Panopto in this setting to create an instructional video for trainees to start learning to use the bone marrow tutorial. Panopto is a lecture capture software that's offered by the UW. We've been capturing for the past year, I believe now, our Hempath, or actually not even the past year, for this academic year, our Hempath lectures using Panopto. So students can then go back to the lecture. After the lecture's been given, they can review material on their own time. So I'd encourage you to check it out. It's, again, free and easy to use if you are UW faculty. Okay, so to start, I give students a link to this Panopto video. It's just a 2-minute video that shows you how to use the bone marrow tutorial. And then they jump into the bone marrow tutorial. So with the tutorial, there are a series of didactic slides, and this is just an example of one that covers trilineage hematopoiesis. So all of the different little squares that you see or buttons that you see are links to other slides, other bits of information. So for instance, if the student wanted to learn more about erythroid cells, they'd click on this green erythroid button. Then you can come to a slide where there is more information about different stages of erythroid maturation. You can click through the different stages, learn more about each of these stages, or if you were interested, you could move on to the quiz. There's a quiz which has 20 questions. This is question number 6. Each of the questions has a variety of different options, which might be either correct, which you might pick and get correct or incorrect. So if you get the answer correct, you'll get feedback that that was the case. If you get the answer incorrect, you'll be asked to try again. And most of the questions have the option to go back and review the didactic material before answering the question. So again, the bone marrow tutorial is a relatively new addition in Hempath. It was just introduced this past August. It's been used by a variety of different trainees in different disciplines. So we have some clinical hematology fellows that have tried it out as they're involved in bone marrow evaluation. We have some lab medicine residents that have tried it out. We have some Hempath fellows that have tried it as well, some medical students that have tried it, and a few technologists in our lab who have tried it. So we conducted a survey regarding the bone marrow tutorial, and I have early results that I can present to you now. We only have at this point 11 respondents, but I can tell you a little bit about what they said. So one of the questions that we asked was, did you find the bone marrow tutorial to be a good use of your time? Of course, very important to know the answer to this question, and gratifying to me to see that all of the respondents did find this to be a good use of their time. Now for the following questions, I asked them to respond on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being least useful and 5 being most useful. And I asked, firstly, how useful did you find the bone marrow tutorial? And the answer was relatively useful. And then I asked specifically about the benefits of the didactic portion of the tutorial versus the quiz portion. And both portions were found to be pretty useful, slightly different, slightly higher for the quiz portion, although probably not a significant difference here. In asking students how easy the bone marrow tutorial was to use, most said that it was relatively easy to use. A couple of people did have some comments about the PowerPoint format being a little challenging, but most people found it pretty easy to use. And then I also asked where they did this bone marrow tutorial. As it's built into PowerPoint, you can do it anywhere. You could do it in the hempath area, you could do it somewhere else at work, or you could even do it at home. And although a fair subset did it in the hempath sign-out area, about 36%, the majority did it in some other area, which tells me that it's a relatively easy program to use wherever you are, and you don't have to be sitting in hempath in order to do it. And then finally, and for me this is a very important question, I wanted to know to what extent the bone marrow tutorial increased the level of comfort the students had in reviewing the actual bone marrow glass slide. And the majority of respondents here said that it increased their comfort level very much. 64.6% noted a significant increase in their comfort level with reviewing bone marrow slides. Now I just want to share some specific comments that came from the comments section of the survey. One student noted that the tutorial helped to bridge the gap between having 0 marrow element recognition knowledge to being able to perform a differential. Another noted that this sort of thing is way more valuable than many hours worth of the many lectures we get. Someone noted, I really like this and would love more advanced versions. And someone else said, having done this ahead of time made my observation in the hempath lab 1,000 times, and that wasn't a typo on my part, so I don't know if it was a typo on their part, but 1,000 times more productive. So definitely something that has been well received by the students who have tried it. So let me tell you a little bit about where we're hoping to go from here with the bone marrow tutorial. As I mentioned, there were some quirks with using PowerPoint, so one thing I'd like to do is to convert this to a web-based page. And one of the respondents actually said if you build it into a web page, the whole world would use it. I don't know about that, but I thought that was funny. I'd like to really do a more formal evaluation of this module, so using things like pre and post tests for students before and after they take the tutorial, get more information from anonymous evaluations, and perhaps look and see if students are better at doing a differential on a glass slide before and after completing the tutorial. I'd also like to create future modules that students can use, and we've scanned our bone marrow study set converted the glass slides into virtual slides. So I'd like to also incorporate versions that use virtual slides. All right, so now we come to the last topic that I want to mention, which is something that for me was very important and kind of eye-opening in doing the Teaching Scholars program. And that is the concept of feedback. So this is a quote from Robert Claddy. I don't know a lot about sports, but he's the Purdue women's soccer coach, and in 2009 he made Big Ten history by becoming the first coach to lead one team to 10 straight seasons of 10 or more victories, and to me that seems like a pretty big accomplishment. So this is his philosophy on coaching. He notes that it's his job to analyze the results of his players and provide feedback, both positive and negative, and try to assist them in learning from their past experiences so that in the future they might make the best decisions available to them. And I have to say that for me as an educator in medical education, boy, I'd really like to be able to achieve this with the trainees that come through hematopathology. So that brings me to the topic of feedback. So what is feedback, and why do I have a rocket ship there? Well, I have the rocket ship there because the concept of feedback, as it's used now in many settings, really came out of the setting of rocket engineering in the 1940s, and now has been co-opted by many different fields. So in the field of rocket engineering, feedback is thought of as information that a system uses to make adjustments in reaching a goal. You can also think of it as the control of a system by reinserting into that system the results of prior performance. So if we bring that into the arena of clinical medicine, with good feedback, the trainee is offered insight into what they actually did in a situation and how that resulted in the consequences of their action. So you can imagine something like this where the trainee does something, it ends up with a result. This is observed by the supervisor, who then provides feedback to the trainee, leading to a better outcome the next time, and essentially leading to learning. With good feedback, the educator can highlight for the trainee a difference between the intended result and the actual result, thereby providing an impetus for the trainee to change and improve their actions. So one important concept to note is that there's a big difference between feedback and evaluation, and I think it's important to note this difference. Feedback is formative. It's part of the learning process, and it's intended to assist the student in reaching a goal. When you're giving feedback, you're usually saying things that are relatively neutral and composed of verbs or nouns. Evaluation, by contrast, is summative. This is what comes after the fact and presents a judgment to the student. This is how you did. It's usually expressed as a normative statement peppered with adverbs and adjectives. So distinguishing these two, I think, I have found for myself has been useful. And also distinguishing sometimes this concept for students is useful when you're giving them feedback. So when it comes to perceptions about feedback, most trainees really feel like they're not getting it. This is a survey from residents at a large academic medical center who had written evaluations that came at the end of the rotation, not too dissimilar from these MedHub evaluations that we fill out, perhaps. The students that were, or the residents that were evaluated here noted that they never or infrequently received corrective feedback 80% of the time. And when it came to positive or reinforcing feedback, 17% said that they never or infrequently received it. The majority received it sometimes, with a minority receiving it often. So it's perhaps no surprise then that only 8% of residents surveyed in this report noted that they were satisfied with the feedback process. So why do we have this problem? That's, I think, an important question for us to ask ourselves. Well, part of the problem may be with regard to the way that feedback is given. Sometimes when feedback is given, it's overly general. Good job, good work, strong work. Sometimes it's given too late in the rotation, so it's given so late that you're not able to act on your feedback, reinsert it into the feedback loop. And in some cases, it may not be recognized by students as feedback. In fact, it's perhaps not surprising that most educators estimate that they give more feedback than students report receiving. So why should we try harder to do feedback well, to give better feedback? Well, there's clearly evidence that feedback improves practice, and the impact of good feedback has been proven in a variety of different clinical settings. In fact, it's rated second to clinical competence as an important feature in a clinical educator. And immediate feedback during a rotation or clinical experience is good not only for the trainee, but also good for the instructor. So with that in mind, I want to tell you about a little study here that was performed, an investigation of medical student reactions to feedback. This was a randomized controlled trial performed by Bowler and colleagues, where they observed medical students learning surgical knot tying, and they divided them into two groups. Group 1 got specific constructive feedback, while Group 2 just got general compliments. Good job, that looks good. So I have a couple of questions for you about these two groups. Firstly, which group do you think performed better on a post-test follow-up? And actually, let me open the polling. Okay. Give you a moment to answer your question here using the audience response. Okay, so let's take a look and see what people had to say. Okay, so which group do you think performed better? Yes, the one who got specific constructive feedback. That's what I would say as well if I read this question, and that is in fact the case. The group that got specific and constructive feedback did better. Okay, question 2, different sort of question, similar but different. Which group do you think was most satisfied with their feedback? Okay, let's see what you have to say. So it looks like 52% think that group 1, the ones that actually performed better, were most satisfied with their feedback. 35% said general compliments were perhaps better perceived by the residents or or medical students in this case. And 13% thought both groups performed equally well. Well, as it turned out, you were right about number 2 for sure. Group 1, who got specific constructive feedback, had improved performance, but were less satisfied with their feedback than Group 2. Now, Group 2 with the general compliments were very satisfied with their feedback, but unfortunately their performance did not improve before and after. So I think this tells us something kind of interesting, right? So we have 2 different things that we've learned here. First, there's evidence that feedback improves practice. But second, student satisfaction might not be an adequate or an accurate predictor of the quality of feedback that's given. And I think this might have some implications for us as educators and how we should go about evaluating the feedback that we give. Okay, so barriers. Why don't we give feedback? What are the barriers we have? Well, people report things like what I have listed here. They don't know how to do it. They don't want to be too negative. They don't have time. They're too busy. It's only a short-term encounter. What kind of difference am I going to really be able to make? And some people are concerned that students may rate you poorly in an evaluation. And given the last slide, I don't know, maybe a student would rate you more poorly on an evaluation. So these are the barriers to feedback, but there's some big dangers to proceeding without feedback. Without feedback, good performance is not enforced, mistakes go uncorrected, and then students can end up developing incorrect assumptions that can impede their learning. They will start to generate their own feedback to external cues, a raised eyebrow from an attending, for instance, and attach inappropriate importance to such cues. And importantly, in these students that go through with their rotations without any feedback, clinical competence is achieved only empirically if it's achieved at all. And the scary part about this is that when you have more experience, your confidence increases, but without feedback, the level of competence might not increase along with it. So you can raise a very dangerous student without feedback. Also, students tend to feel adrift and uncertain without good feedback. So it's really our fault, I think, if we're not giving good feedback to our trainees, because we create these students that have uncertainty, discomfort, might become arrogant, or have decreased competence. So it's really critical, I think, that we work on giving better feedback. Good feedback would provide a trainee with timely, vital information regarding their performance that allows them to adjust their actions to allow for improvement during the course of their rotation. And there are a few different articles that suggest ways to give better feedback. I'd like to encourage you to take a look at this one by Jack Endy. It was written back in 1983, but I think everything that he says is very relevant to this day. And I'll just give you some of his pearls about what good feedback should be. So he notes that good feedback should be presented with the idea that teacher and trainee are allies with common goals. You're both there to make the trainee a better physician, or better whatever it is they're aiming to do. So in order to do this, it's important to set goals and expectations ahead of time so there are no surprises for the trainee. You want to maybe let the trainee know when feedback is coming, when to expect it. And it might be useful as well to let them know the difference between feedback and evaluation. It's important that your timing is right, so feedback should be well-timed, expected, and ideally close to the event or action that you'd like them to work on. And it's important to let students know when feedback is being given. As I noted earlier, more educators report giving feedback than students report receiving. So you might even consider being explicit about this and saying something like, let's take some time for feedback, or perhaps, I'm giving you feedback now. Okay, so good feedback should also be specific. It should be based on first-hand data and not hearsay. It should deal with specifics and generalizations, so I'll challenge you to not say good job anymore. And if it's subjective, which is okay, it should be labeled as subjective. Students, you should just be aware that you acknowledge that what you're saying to them is subjective. Finally, feedback should be thoughtful and formative. You should regulate the quantity of feedback that you give and limit it to things or behaviors that are actually changeable. It should be phrased in descriptive and non-evaluative language. And it should deal with decisions and actions rather than assumed intentions or interpretations. So with that, I'd like to summarize. This afternoon, I've told you a little bit about what the Teaching Scholars Program is. I've told you about some important lessons that I've learned from the Teaching Scholars Program and have, since doing the program, incorporated into my practice. And that's primarily learning the importance of engaging our learners and the importance of giving good feedback. And then I've described to you some tools that are available at UW that you can use and incorporate into your teaching to make it more effective. And that includes things like the audience response software, the lecture capture software. I've told you a little bit about Attendee Portal, and of course the Teaching Scholars Program. Any of you that are clinician educators, I would definitely encourage you to think about trying the program. It has been a great benefit to me, and I'm very thankful to the department and to my division for allowing me to do it. So with that, I would like to end, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Brad.
Lovely talk, Sindhu. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I wonder, do you have a perspective, or was this discussed at all in this training session that you had about fostering an environment to receive feedback? I mean, you spoke specifically about ways that we can do it better, but it seems to me another component might be what kind of environment do you have that might foster, in which people would be more willing to accept that kind of feedback and get the point number one and all the benefits of point number one.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. How can we go about fostering an environment where trainees are receptive to receiving the feedback that we provide? Do I have it? So I think that part of doing that goes back to some of ND's suggestions. One thing that I think and that I have found very useful in making me more comfortable giving feedback, and I think also in making trainees more comfortable in receiving it, is to really emphasize the difference between feedback and evaluation. I'm not telling you you're doing a bad job. I'm not making a judgment about your performance. We're working together to try and improve your performance. This is feedback. It's something that is part of a cycle. It's putting information back into the system to help you do a better job next time. This is evaluation. I think you did a bad job. It's at the end of the rotation. We're done. So I think making that distinction for me has been very helpful. The other thing that I found is letting students know at the beginning of a rotation that feedback is coming, and this is my intent with feedback, to help to improve the system. I think giving them fair warning that it's coming beforehand is also helpful, and sometimes allows people to get less caught off guard by it. I think that most people, if they feel like you're both on the same page and they're not just being harshly graded or harshly evaluated, are very open to it. And I've found that to be the case, I think, most of the times that I've actively tried to give feedback since doing the Teaching Scholars.
Have you had any experience teaching other people to give feedback? Like, so for example, staff to staff, for example.
Yeah. So have I had any experience teaching people to give feedback, for instance, in a staff-to-staff sort of interaction? I think that is something that is challenging. I mean, I think that all of us who are involved in any sort of administrative duties in our laboratories, or for that matter, anyone who has a colleague, encounters this problem or this challenge. I can't say that I have tried formally to do this, I certainly have informally had discussions with people about how I do things, let them know like what I find works for me, and encourage them to try new things, to try a new approach if what they're doing for feedback isn't working. I think it's a good question, and I think it's something we all need to work on.
Besides the audience participation tool, which I think is totally cool, what are other ways, what kinds of questions, do you leave them open-ended? Do you ask multiple choice questions? What kinds of interactive things do you recommend if you're not going to do that?
So do you mean what kind of questions do you ask in the setting of audience response, or how do you? Without the audience response.
Well, a little bit more on the interactive without the audience response.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that depends a little on the size of your group, right? So if you're in a group where maybe it's 20 people or something like that, or even let's say 50 people, one option would be to use something like cases that people have to work through, or questions that have not just a yes or no answer. You could do things like divide your group of 20, let's say, into 4 groups of 5, and have the small groups work on the various questions that you've given them together, and then come back as a group and present what they have learned or what they've discovered in their time together as a small group. I think if you have a small enough session, it's always more effective to break a bigger group into smaller groups rather than doing the direct lecture style teaching, or at least to have a portion of your lecture where that is happening. I think the more interaction you have, the better.
The undergrad program is really broken into lectures. Do you recommend dismantling that into something else?
Well, I will say that the undergrad program, as in the MedTech program. So, I think there's some role for lecture. I did find when I was teaching in the MedTech program that they loved the audience response. And before I knew about the audience response, I would do cases and solicit information from them to address the questions that came up during the case. I mean, I think the more that we can incorporate things like that into our teaching, the more that we can get the students doing in the classroom as opposed to just like listening in the classroom, the better off it'll be. The more they'll actually learn, the more they'll take home and retain. So I'm not saying that lectures should go away entirely, but I think we need to think about ways to enhance them with more active learning opportunities. Yeah? Well?
So with the active participation and presentation of cases, for example, as a way to interact, one, I guess, concern as a trainer that I've had is not having a comprehensive overview. So if you're really in-depth, you may take away a lot from that individual case, but then you're having gaps in the knowledge that hasn't been covered well. Any recommendations for how to, because that really takes a lot of time, how to cover the entire material?
Well, I would say I think that's a problem that comes up sometimes with problem-based learning settings in medical schools, for instance. There are a few medical schools that are solely problem-based learning, which I always have that concern about that particular setting. But I think the way to get around that is to use things like these cases in a directed fashion, and to present some pre-material, be it reading material that they'd have ahead of time, or lecture, or maybe a Panopto video that you've made for them that they can watch ahead of time. So they have you have some information or basis to start approaching the case. And I'd say the other thing to add to make sure there aren't gaps is to have a curriculum with a list of things they need to know about. So I think both of those can help. I think the concern that you raise is one that makes it difficult to work in an entirely case-based educational system.
Well, we're at 4:30, so if anybody has additional questions, feel free to stay after to Dr. Cherian.
All right, thank you.